Hey everybody, how are you? I'm fine. The topic for this lecture is the U.S. Civil War in the 1860s. And what I want to do is talk about the U.S. Civil War as a Southern nationalist movement. We've been discussing nationalism now for a couple of weeks, and we looked in particular at the examples of Italy and Germany and how nationalism can be a unifying force. We've also talked about how it can be divisive, as it was in Serbia with Kosovo, and as it was in the United States in the 1860s, or I should say in the decades up to and including the 1860s. So we're going to try to look at the Civil War as a war about two distinct cultures. And the one in the South, the Southerners, are the ones who said, we don't want to be a part of this country anymore. We need our own country. In the early 19th century, the United States had been developing for a couple of hundred years already, through the colonial period and then up to the Revolution and now the early 1800s. They developed quite differently. In the North, there were twice as many people, first of all. It was more urban, it was more industrial, it had more railroads, more transportation, it had more banking, actually, which made capital, which you can use to build and develop businesses, more accessible. In the South, you had an agriculture-based economy. It was very rural and agrarian. You had half as many people. In the North, it was a faster-paced society where people were more interested in or more open to change. And in the South, it was more conservative and more traditional. And of course, in the North, you didn't have slaves. By the early 19th century, all the northern states had made slavery illegal. And in the South, not only did you have slaves, you actually needed them to maintain that culture and society. Most Southerners did not own slaves, but the ones who did, they were growing cash crops for export, mostly cotton, but not only cotton, rice, tobacco, and other things. They needed slaves. There were actually small family farms that also grew cash crops, but the wealthy planter class that had plantations with a lot of slaves, they dominated Southern politics and society. So they were very different places, and you will be reading about that. When the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution in 1789, they recognized that slavery wasn't really consistent with the principles of freedom and liberty and all of that that the Revolution was supposed to stand for. But they didn't address slavery when they made the country's new laws. They kind of thought that slavery would sort of die out. They thought it would die a natural death. But they were wrong, because what happened was in the 1790s, the cotton gin was developed, and this made the growing of cotton much more lucrative than it had been. And there was this, this great expansion of cotton production and the slavery that was needed for it. So slavery actually wasn't going away, it was growing in the United States in the 19th century. But it wasn't the existence of slavery that caused the Civil War, actually. What caused the Civil War was the issue of the expansion of slavery. As the United States and settlers moved westward and became a bigger country, would slavery come along? On the map here, you can see the extent of the United States after the purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803. And when those territories opened up, what would happen was settlers would move west, and there's a whole story about Native Americans that we'll be looking at later. But the settlers would move west. They would build their homesteads and start a farm and have some land and develop, town eventually. And finally, when you had enough settlers in a place, you could write up a constitution for a state and then request membership in the United States of America as a formal state instead of as just a territory. And that's how westward expansion worked. So Tennessee, Kentucky, and Ohio had been added as states after the Revolution in that manner. This is an image of This is a pretty famous image that celebrates this concept called manifest destiny, which was manifest, by the way, means kind of obvious or visible to something that you can easily see. And destiny is, of course, fate. And the manifest destiny doctrine was really popular in the early to mid 19th century and beyond. And the manifest destiny idea was that it was the United States' obvious fate, obvious manifest destiny to travel all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, that it was supposed to spread all the way to the Pacific. So there was this fever for a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people really felt like America had to move west. It was supposed to move west. And if you look at this image, you can see what they thought they were doing when they moved west. They were bringing civilization into the wilderness. You can see this diaphanous figure floating above the land. She's carrying this book that symbolizes knowledge. She's got a wire coiled around her arm, and she's carrying the wire in her other hand that's attached to a telegraph line. The telegraph is a new invention at this time. Behind her, you can see the products of civilization. You see a railroad, you see commerce, you see ships on a waterway, that's the Mississippi River. You see stagecoaches with these intrepid pioneers. They're moving west and creating lives and lifestyles for themselves in towns and states, and eventually they'll join the United States. And they're bringing with them, when the pioneers come, when the Americans come, they're bringing with them civilization and light, which is made so obvious in this picture. So that's the vision that Americans had of themselves and their purpose and the idea of moving west. So Americans were sort of feverish about moving west. So anyway, they're moving west, they're following their manifest destiny. And the first real sign that there was going to be a problem with moving west and slavery was the Missouri Compromise in 1820. In 1820, the state of Missouri requested to join the Union as a slave state. And the problem was that at this time there were 11 states in the north and 11 states in the south. There were 22 states. Half of them were slave and half of them were not. And this was an important concept, this idea that you needed to have equal numbers of slave and free states. Every single state gets to send 2 senators to the U.S. federal government. No matter how big or small the state is, they all get to send 2 senators. So if you have the same number of states from the north and the south, you have the same number of senators from the north and the south. And this was important, this balance in the federal government. That's what they kept saying. They wanted balance in the federal government. But if Missouri joined as a slave state, that would upset the balance. That would mean there would be more slave states than free states in the Senate. And there was this 2-year discussion about what they should do about this. They were a little bit surprised that that this was a big problem. In fact, there's this famous quote from Thomas Jefferson who said that this Missouri question was like a fire alarm going off in the night, and he was really scared about the future of the Union, which, by the way, was only a few decades old at that point. So this question, when they're like debating it in the federal government, well, what are we going to do? Oh, no, we shouldn't allow them because then there'll be more slaves than free. And they were bickering about it. And finally, they were rescued by the fact that Maine, which had been a part of New Hampshire, requested to be its own state and break away from New Hampshire. So it did. And that meant that you could get 1 free state and 1 slave state. So now, after the Missouri Compromise, you have an equal number of free and slave states, 12 now. But the other thing that the Missouri Compromise did was they decided to try to avoid future problems like that by making what they called the Missouri Compromise line. And if you look on the map here, you can see where the Missouri Compromise line is. And this was a line that said, or the agreement said, that you could not have any slavery in the new territories above the Missouri Compromise line. And below, you could have slavery. And this applied to what they call the Louisiana Purchase territory. And you can see this is where it is. So the Missouri Compromise line was established to avoid, hopefully, future problems. But it was, like Jefferson said, a real kind of wake-up call that maybe the slavery question was going to be a big problem in the future. The next important event that happened on the road to the Civil War was the Mexican-American War. This happened about 25 years after the Missouri Compromise. Again, manifest destiny is in the air. Everybody is all feverish about westward expansion. And James K. Polk was from the South. He was both a Southerner and he was an expansionist. He really believed strongly in the manifest destiny principles or ideal. At this time, some of the Northerners were a little wary of expanding to the west, because if you look at the map, you'll see that that expanding to the west, you got a lot more territory in the west, in the south, that you can expand into, because the Americans are already pretty far to the west in the north. So they knew that as America went west, that they would likely be doing that in the southern part, and that meant that slavery might be expanding too. So not everybody loved the idea of expanding west, but this guy did. Polk really wanted to expand west. So what he did was he first tried to buy California from the Mexican government. After he tried to buy California from Mexico, and they said no, he decided that he would kind of orchestrate a war so that they could go to war with Mexico. In 1846 that happened, and it lasted a couple years, and the Americans won. And after the war, the Americans forced the Mexican government to yield a huge chunk of its territory. And so they got this huge chunk of Mexico, or what used to be Mexico, after the Mexican-American War. 1.2 million square miles of land became a part of the United States after the Mexican-American War. If you look on the map, you'll see that that is those of you who know American geography will see on the map that it is now Utah, Nevada, California, New Mexico, and Texas. Texas is kind of a special case. Texas actually had declared itself independent from Mexico in the 1830s, in 1836. Texas had been populated by a bunch of Southerners, American Southerners, who moved into what became Texas, which was part of Mexico. They were encouraged by the Mexican government, as a matter of fact, because the Mexican government was having a hard time managing that territory way far north of the capital. So a lot of Americans had moved into Texas in 1830. They brought slaves with them. In 1836, they declared independence from the Mexican government, and they were the Lone Star Republic. So Texas was its own state for like a minute, from like less than a decade, because after they were an independent state for a while, they requested membership in the Union as a slave state, and they got it right after Polk was elected. So in 1846, this question about how big or how small Texas was still remained. The Mexican government and the Texas independent country had been arguing about it, and now the North and the South are going to argue about how big or how small Texas is, because since Texas allowed slavery, the bigger it was, the more slavery would be there. So there was this big question about what they're going to do with all this land that they got from Texas. And it was very complex. There were a lot of open questions. They needed to know how big or how small was Texas. They needed to know whether or not slavery was going to be allowed in the territories that were won in the Mexican-American War. They called it the, quote, Mexican Cession. That's what it's called, the Mexican Cession. They needed to figure out whether California should be admitted as a free state, which would upset the balance in the Senate. And that at that point, there were 13 of free and 13 slave states. So they were worried about that. And there was also a problem with escaped slaves, slaves who were fugitives. They fled from the South, they went to the North, and the Northerners just sort of ignored the fact that they were slaves. And the Southerners complained that the Northerners didn't help them capture their escaped slaves. So when in the federal government, they had these big debates about what they were going to do about all these questions, and they came up with another compromise, the Compromise of 1850. One of the things about this compromise was that it was really, really unpopular. Like, nobody was happy with this compromise. Instead of the federal government deciding whether or not there was going to be slavery in the Mexican Cession, they decided that the people who moved there get to decide. The people who moved there get to decide. That's a concept called popular sovereignty. Another thing that they decided was that California could enter as a free state. They also decided about the boundary of Texas, and if you look at the map, you can see that disputed area. They took they split that in half. So so Texas is about here, the actual border. So that meant that all of that territory would be slave, because Texas was a slave state, like I said. They banned the slave trade in Washington, D.C. because, it sort of offended the Northerners who were hanging out there working for the federal government. But they did not ban slavery, just the trade of slavery, meaning buying and selling slaves. And finally, and really significantly, it passed the fugitive slave law. There already was a fugitive slave law, but it wasn't very strong. This fugitive slave law was a law that made the Northerners help the Southerners capture their escaped slaves. So marshals would be rewarded if they captured slaves, and Northerners could be prosecuted if they didn't turn in or try to help capture slaves, or I should say blacks that people claimed were their slaves. So it really, really made the Northerners mad. It infuriated them, as a matter of fact. For a while now, they've been sitting there, not really loving slavery, but not really doing a lot about it. They were kind of uneasy with it, but they weren't trying to stop it. There were some people trying to stop it, the abolitionists, but they were actually much smaller in number in the first half of the 19th century than they became by the middle, and certainly before the Civil War in the 1850s. So, but now the Northerners are, they're participating in the maintenance of this institution, and that made them really angry. I want to add as an aside here that the Northerners didn't ban slavery because they thought it was evil. I mean, some of them surely did. But one of the biggest problems that Northerners had with slavery was that it meant that people who wanted to get jobs had to compete with slaves, and it made it harder for them to get jobs, because if you could have a slave or pay a worker, which would you choose? So most people in the North opposed slavery because it was bad for other people who wanted to get jobs and work. That was one of the biggest positions of the anti-slavery forces. So anyway, but the abolitionist movement starts, especially after the Fugitive Slave Act. It starts to really grow. And in the upper right-hand corner here, you see this picture from a very famous book called Uncle Tom's Cabin by an abolitionist named Harriet Beecher Stowe. And she wrote this book, and it's this very famous book, like I said, but it's like a soap opera. It's like this really big, dramatic story about a slave named Tom, and his family and friends, and also his owners or masters and overseers, and it tells his whole life story and puts him in this very sympathetic light. Tries to humanize him and all the characters, and about his worries and his concerns as a father, and the people that he loves, and it really humanizes him, and it just vilifies some of the vilifies slavery and slave owners, and particularly the overseer Simon Legree, who's in the picture. And it just was this really awful story about how terrible life is as a slave. I mean, it was just heartbreaking. And one of the things that she does throughout the book, because she's writing this for a Northern audience, no Southerner is going to read a story like this, and she says, oh, how can we Northerners, how can we stand it when something like this is happening? And how can we participate by following this new law? And they kind of, says that we're all guilty of allowing this to happen. And it was a really big deal. Like, everybody read it, and there were stage shows presented of this story. And when Abraham Lincoln, who was president during the Civil War, when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said something like, so you're the lady who started this Civil War. So the book was very popular, and it really helped kind of crystallize these different views that the Northerners and the Southerners had of each other. So the Compromise of 1850 is really, really when things start to take a very bad turn. here's a map that shows the United States, the free and the slave territories at that time in the 1850s, or in 1850 during the compromise, when the compromise was made. And you can see there is this orange territory, the New Mexico territory and the Utah territory. That's the territory where popular sovereignty is going to be applied. That's where the people who move there and settle that area are going to be able to do it, to decide what's going to happen. And then in the north, where it's to the north and the east of that, the unorganized territory, that's territory from the Louisiana Purchase, and that's above the Missouri Compromise line, so no slavery can happen there. That's what's supposed to go on in that part. Now, what happens after the Compromise of 1850 throughout the whole next 10 years was so bad that historians call it the crisis of the 1850s. And the first really big deal was the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was passed in 1854. This act was pushed by a senator from Illinois named Stephen Douglas. He was a Democrat, and he didn't love slavery, but he wanted the Southerners in the Senate to support an idea that he had about a railroad that would be built across the country. And so in order to get these Southern senators to support his idea for the railroad, he pushed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And what the Kansas-Nebraska Act did was it established the principle of popular sovereignty in the Kansas and Nebraska territories. So if you look at this map, you see that those territories that used to be where slavery was banned by the Missouri Compromise, they're now areas where slavery can happen if the people who move there decide that's what they want. It was infuriating to the Southerners, to the Northerners. It was infuriating. They're like, what do you mean popular sovereignty there? We decided this in 1820, no slavery up there. But Douglas was able to get enough votes in the Senate to have the act passed. So it was very, very upsetting to the anti-slavery forces of the North. And Douglas was quite unpopular for some people. And here's the two maps compared. And you can see that now there's a lot more territory that's opened up to the possibility of slavery. So the Northerners and anti-slavery folks were not very happy. And the passage of this act it created this really crazy story where all these people from both the North and the South moved to the Kansas territory. They stampeded there. They were orchestrated by immigration societies that would try to set up the transportation and the settlement there. And they wanted to establish themselves as residents of this territory so that they could vote on the question of what the new state would look like in this Kansas territory. And they were really bad to each other. They were the gangs of pro and anti-slavery forces that would go and attack one another. They would attack each other's homes. They would attack each other's offices. They would attack each other's towns. They would attack each other's gatherings. It was like a guerrilla war, actually. And it went on for years and years. There was a really famous raid by this guy. His name is John Brown, and he was a very staunch abolitionist, and he really thought he was on a mission from God to end the evil of slavery. So what happened was the town of Lawrence, which was the headquarters of the anti-slavery people, the capital of what they claimed was the state of Kansas, or the territory of Kansas, they attacked Lawrence and they burned buildings and just sacked it all together. So in retaliation, John Brown organized a band of guys to go and attack some pro-slavery folks and killed some of them. So it was really, really bad. And they called the whole thing, the whole stretch of time where the episode that lasted for quite a while, they called it Bleeding Kansas. And it was, like I said, it went on for years. While it was going on, there was this incident in the government, in the Senate, where, again, just like in Kansas, there's violence. There was a senator from Massachusetts who was appalled at what was happening in Kansas, and so he made this big, long speech. It took him 2 days to make this speech in the Senate about what he called the crime against Kansas, and he was talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act and also these marauding gangs of people that were trying to establish Kansas as either a free or a slave state. And in the speech, he totally insulted a Southern senator. He mentioned him by name. He said that he was in love with slavery, that slavery was his harlot, which is a whore, a prostitute. And it was this real insult. And in Southern culture, that was like totally not cool. In Southern culture, you had to defend your honor and your reputation. And so after he made the speech, the next day, the nephew of the senator, his name was Butler, the nephew of Senator Butler went into the Senate and just beat up the Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, just smacked him over the head over and over again. He had buddies there who were keeping other people from intervening, so it was a really ugly episode in the federal government. Charles Sumner actually never fully recovered from the beating, but you know, he was badly injured. In the South, the guy who beat him, the nephew of Butler, whose name was Brooks was a hero in the South because he was defending the honor of his uncle and of the South in general. In fact, people would like send him canes that he could, you know, that could replace the one. He broke his cane. He broke his cane on the head of Charles Sumner. So they would send him replacement canes and say, one of them said, "Hit him again." And meanwhile, in the North, people were like, "Oh my God, those Southerners, they're so brutal." It's like just another example of the violence and the brutality that was sort of underpinning the society. So that was another episode in the crisis of the 1850s. Another was another really big one was the Dred Scott decision, right? This is a Supreme Court decision in 1857. Dred Scott was a slave who had lived he was owned by a doctor, and the doctor moved to free Northern Territory for a little while, took Dred Scott with him, and then he moved back to the South. Dred Scott sued his master and said because he moved to the North at some point in his life, that meant that he was emancipated, he was freed, because you can't be a slave in the North. And so he challenged his he challenged his status as a slave. And it went to the Supreme Court. It took a little time to get through the court system and all that, but when it finally was decided, the justice, Roger Taney, and he was a Southerner, he not only made a ruling about whether or not Dred Scott was a slave, that was the question before him, but he decided he wanted to, make a really big statement. So what he ruled was that blacks, whether they were free or slaves, could not be citizens. They had no rights. Dred Scott didn't even have the right to sue this guy, right? So forget the case. You can't even sue him. You don't have the right to do that. He also ruled that slavery cannot be banned from any territory in the United States because that would violate the right to property. So that meant that the northern, that territory above the Missouri Compromise line was, when they banned slavery there, that wasn't even constitutional. I mean, the Kansas-Nebraska Act reversed it anyway, but this said Congress can't ban slavery, and this was infuriating to Northerners who were worried about the possibility of a similar challenge to state laws, about somebody maybe trying to make a Supreme Court argument that you couldn't ban slavery anywhere. So it was a really creepy thing for the Northern anti-slavery folks. And this was a really huge decision. It was yet another episode in the 1850s illustrating this big divide between the two of them. And then finally, the last one I'm going to mention before the final one, the second to the last one, is this John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Now, you might remember John Brown from Bleeding, Kansas. He was a staunch abolitionist, like some would say fanatical abolitionist who went and he was involved in a bunch of raids in Kansas, a couple of famous ones, but the one on Osawatomie Creek, or Pottawatomie Creek, is the one that was that I mentioned earlier. Anyway, after that he was on the run. He was wanted. It wasn't like you could just kill people and then that was okay. He was living with aliases and whatnot. But he raises like little tiny army of like 20 people to go to Harper's Ferry, which was an arsenal in Virginia, and to break into it and to lead an insurrection in Virginia by arming slaves with these weapons. And so he did that, He actually did it. He went to Harper's Ferry. They broke into the arsenal. They started arming slaves and marched through the countryside, but they eventually got caught. And when he got caught, he was tried and then he was executed for treason. And he, again, was like Charles Sumner and the guy who got hit on the head with the cane. John Brown, when he was executed for treason, was this like symbol of the divide between the North and the South. The Southerners thought that this whole episode of breaking into a federal arsenal and arming slaves, that was a really big example of how the North was determined to crush the South. And in the North, he was held up as a martyr who was willing to die and take really serious action for these principles. So Harper's Ferry was another really big episode in the crisis of the 1850s. The last thing, the thing that really triggered the Civil War, was the election of 1860. In this election, which is the election that President Lincoln won, there were 4 candidates. There was actually 2 candidates for the Democratic Party. At this time, you had 2 political parties. You had the Democrats and you had the Republicans. And the Republicans had just been born in the 1850s, which I'll talk about in just a second. But what happened was the Southerners, who were in the Democratic Party, and the Northerners, who were in the Democratic Party, were so divided that they couldn't agree on a candidate. So you had a candidate for the Northern Democrats and one for the Southern Democrats. You also had Lincoln for the Republican Party, like I said, just born. And you had another guy named Bell, who was a Southerner, the Constitutional Union Party. Lincoln received only 40% of the popular vote, but he won enough votes in the Electoral College to win the election. And here's a map oops, that's the wrong map. And here's a map that shows that. In the United States, if you win the most votes in a particular state, you get all of that state's units, all of that state's electoral votes. So if you look at this map, you'll see that Lincoln won the most populous state, so he got all of their electoral votes. But if you look at this map, you'll see that it was really 2 different elections. In the North, you had Lincoln running, mostly against Douglas, and in the South, you had Breckinridge and Bell. Because what had happened was you really had, the Democratic Party had completely divided. The Republican Party only campaigned in the North. They didn't even try to reach the South. In fact, Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in the Southern states. So you really had 2 kind of separate elections. I mean, it was one election, but it looked like this, 2 separate elections. And one of the planks of the Republican Party platform was that there would be no expansion of slavery. And he won. He won the election. He won the election in a party that said, we're not going to let slavery, we don't want slavery to expand. And the Southerners were like, oh, this guy can't be our president. We need our own country. And so what happens next, we'll be talking about more in class, but it was after the election of Lincoln that the first of the Southern states said, we're leaving, and that was South Carolina. And that happened in December, just shortly after the election. So it was the election of Lincoln that really kind of ended the crisis of the 1850s and started the Civil War. So that's it. You have in the build-up to the Civil War and this breakaway, you have the Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1850, the crisis of the 1850s, and then the election of Lincoln. And all of these sort of illustrate how these 2 regions had become so much further apart until eventually the region in the South said, we're out of here. We don't belong in the same country as you. We need our own country. And that's what they tried to create, and that's what we're going to be talking about next time.